Hey, what's up, guys? It's William here with the Coalition, and Santos, Jarhead, Johnny, and myself are really excited to come bring to you our first in a series of tutorial videos on determining elevation. Everyone always asks, when I first started playing the game, I always asked, well, how do you know what the elevation of a shot is? And most folks said, either go find a guide or practice. Well, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a better way that you can do in real time while you're playing the game, and it works with any club, on any hole, on any course, and it's going to be a great addition to the tools in your toolbox to really step up your game. This first picture here is just a picture of a golf course where it has an extreme downhill elevation, and we have similar holes in Golf Clash. And so we need to go over the basic concept of why is elevation important. And this is basically a pictorial representation of a golf shot. And so your main axis here, which has your distances on, if we look at sort of that middle green line, that's going to show you if I hit my shot on a flat lie, I'm going to hit it around 165 yards. The first line around 140 yards, that green line, that's going to represent, well, what happens if I'm hitting to an uphill lie, or the ground I'm hitting to is higher than what I'm at. Well, as you can see here, the ball's going to hit at that green spot, and that's going to make you lose around 20 to 25 yards of distance. And then similarly, if you look at the third green line around 180 yards, you'll see that's going to be a downhill lie in relation to where your ball or where you're standing and hitting it from. And so in that example, you're going to gain about 20 to 25 yards based off of the shot. And so in Golf Clash, this concept still exists. And so we have to be able to account for these elevation changes when we're moving, either uphill or downhill with our ball, so we can make sure we take into account how that's going to affect our landing position, rollout, and ball placement. And so we've really come up with an exciting way to be able to do that using Zoom inside of the app. And so the first concept we really need to understand is base elevation. And so what base elevation is the elevation of a shot based on if your landing spot is uphill, flat, or downhill with respect from the location of your ball. And as we'll discuss later on, the base elevation may change depending on several factors that you can use. And the most common one of those is wind direction and strength. But don't worry, we're going to go over that in detail later on. But let's first start off with how do we determine that base elevation using Zoom? And so you can determine this based off of how much we're allowed to zoom into the bullseye. Almost all of the shots in Golf Clash either use a flat or a downhill elevation. And you normally see this in your wind app when you go off and you would put either plus 10 or plus 20. And so the higher the number that you put in, from a plus, standpoint, that means it's more downhill. So if you put plus 20 in your wind app, that means you're saying it's plus 20% downhill elevation as compared to if you did plus 10, that would only be plus 10% elevation. And so when you're adding plus numbers for all of our clubs, it's going to make you pull more rings to account for that downhill shot, because you're trying to make sure the ball lands where you aimed at your bullseye point for most shots. And so while you're looking forward from your shot or ball location, your maximum zoom into the bullseye is based upon being on ground level with the location of where your ball is at. And so therefore we can determine the plus numbers based off of the amount of zoom. And that sounds harder than it is. And so don't worry, we're going to demonstrate this concept several times through showing you several different videos, pictures, and even playing. And so let's turn over to the first video. So in this video here, you can see I just zoomed as far out as I possibly can, and now I'm going to zoom in as far possible as I can. And you can see here, I can get really, really zoomed in close to that bullseye. And I'll zoom back out, and I'm going to zoom back in as far as I can. Now at a lower spot. And here you can see I can get less. So let's let's rewind this angle just a little bit, because this is a good picture here that's going to sort of demonstrate what I'm talking about. So here you can see from this camera angle advantage, that shot is lower in relation to where if I was standing right here on this hillside. And so it's the same exact concept. And so when you fast forward and you see maximum zoom that I can get into on that shot, I can't zoom in nearly as far on the bullseye as I could when it was on the hillside. So if I go back to the hillside, you can see I can zoom in almost all the way into that bullseye. And if I move the bullseye even farther up the hill, I'll be able to get completely there. And so when you can get all the way into the bullseye, that's going to be 0% elevation as a base elevation, as compared to in the rough bump shot, I can't get nearly as far into that bullseye, and that's going to represent around 10% elevation when you're playing that shot. And so as you can see, intuitively, I'm further down the hill, and so therefore I'm going to have more of a downhill shot, or I'm going to need more elevation as compared to if I was playing the shot from the side of the hill. So this is another shot showing the same exact concept. And we're going to compare 2 points here. We're going to compare the point sort of on the top of that flat portion where you see the bullseye now. And then we're going to go down to the bottom side of that bunker and demonstrate the same exact zoom concept there. So as I play the shot here, you can see the maximum amount that I can zoom in to this shot, it will not let me get to the bullseye. And then once again, this right here, this shot, I would say is 10% elevation as my base elevation. So I can zoom all the way out. I zoom all the way back in as far as it'll let me go and see how far I can. And that represents 10% elevation when you're at that angle. Now, when I go to the bottom of the bullseye, or correction, the sand trap here, and I try to zoom in again, you can see that severe downslope from the top of the hill to here. And so that's going to be more downhill, and so I'm going to need more elevation if I wanted to try to play that Nirvana shot on the bottom of that bunker. And so, in summary, on top of the hill, I'm going to have elevation, so I'm going to have some downhill, but it's not going to be nearly as much as if I played it from the bottom of the bunker. And that's a great shot that demonstrates that's as far as I can physically zoom in on the game, and that's going to represent about 30% elevation if you're trying to play that particular shot from there. In this example, I'm starting off completely zoomed out for this particular shot. And now you'll see I'm going to zoom all the way in as far as I possibly can. And so here, that right there is the maximum amount I can zoom in. And so that once again demonstrates that I'm now at a downhill elevation in relationship to the tee box on this drive of where I want to land the ball. And so this represents about 20% base elevation when you're taking this shot. The game physically will not allow you to zoom in any further than that. And so when you're at 0 elevation, you'll be able to zoom all the way into that green circle of your bullseye because it's in line with the tee box. And if you look backwards, you can see the second tee there is definitely above the landing location. And so in this particular hole, the base elevation for this particular shot would be 20%. Now, if you look at the first tee box there, if we were at that spot, we would expect to have a lower elevation for this same shot because the second tee box is lower. And so most likely it's going to be either 10 or 15% elevation. But this same zoom method would work, and you would be able to zoom in closer to that bullseye if you were on first tee as compared to second tee. And similarly, for a Masters or third tee, it looks like you're even further back, and so this shot might play 5 to 10% elevation more, depending on how much higher that tee box is. In this last set of shots here, I just want to show you different shots with different clubs and how the method works. And so for every single one of these shots, you're going to see the maximum amount that I could zoom in on the shot, and we're going to correlate that to a specific base elevation. Remember, there's other things that might factor into what elevation we actually use for the shot. So we'll go ahead and start looking at some of these videos here. So for example, in this shot, that's the maximum amount that I can zoom in. And so I would place that as a base elevation of 20%. Here's an approach shot with a grizzly on a completely different hole. And what you'll see here is I can zoom all the way into that green circle. And so because I can zoom all the way into that bullseye, I'm going to play that at 0%. Here's another example here where I can zoom in about to the white ring, or in perpendicular to the white ring there. That's a good picture of that. And so that represents 10% base elevation for this particular drive on this hole. Here's another shot with a drive where we'll zoom in. That's the maximum amount that I can zoom in for that shot. And so I would play this shot at 15% base elevation because it's farther away from where 10% was, because 10% I was almost, I'm going to say parallel on the plane of the white ring. And here I'm above that. And then 20% I would be farther away, as we've illustrated on some of the other shots. So this one right here, based off of where we're hitting from, would be 15% elevation. Now we move to this sniper shot here. So for this sniper shot, once again, I'm going to zoom completely into the shot, and that right there is as far as I can zoom in. That represents 30% base elevation for when you're playing this shot. And so you can see the more downhill this shot is, the less I can actually zoom into my target bullseye. And you've probably seen this when you've played the game before, and we've just put it together to determine what that base elevation actually is. In this shot, you can see I can zoom in that far. That represents about 10% elevation for that particular one. Here's another good example of a sniper that's on a hill. And so you can see as the sniper's at the top of the hill, I'm almost, it does go downhill. And so these are a little bit more tricky, but I would start off with 10% elevation at the top of the hill. As compared to if I go all the way down to the green and try to take that shot, I'm going to play that at about 25% elevation. 20% elevation for that particular one. And then the last shot here would be another drive. And you can see I can zoom in, and that's as far as I can go. And so I'm going to play that at 20% elevation. And so fundamentally, the amount of zoom that we can zoom in, the more zoom, the less downhill. Or the less zoom, it's more downhill, which means more elevation. So here you can see a summary slide that we put together that shows you some of the more common elevations that we encounter while we're playing the game. And so in the far top left, you're going to see where I can zoom all the way in to that green bullseye, and that represents 0% elevation. And then as you move down to 10%, you can see where I'm pretty much right in line of the plane of the white ring there, and that's going to represent 10%. You can see as you get farther away, 15%, 20%, and 30%. And so look at the big difference between the amount I can zoom just between 0 and 30, or even 10 and 30. And so ultimately, that's what this method is doing. It's looking at the incremental change in zoom and basing the base elevation off of that incremental change. And so this method does take some practice to get used to. If you go into some of the lower tours and just start practicing it, you're going to get a hang of it relatively quickly, and you'll be able to start predicting, hey, that's a base elevation of 10% or 30% or 0%. Zero is pretty easy. Now, I will tell you, when it comes to uphill shots, this gets a little bit trickier, because you're going to try to amount for how much extra you can zoom into the bullseye. But like I said, based off our experience, there's very few uphill shots in the game of Golf Clash. But it still can be done. Similarly, you'll just have to play around with that. But we went with the 95% solution, which would be downhill shots, and that's what we're demonstrating here. But practice and some tour play, get a hang of it, and this is going to be a game changer for you, where you're just trying to predict that base elevation. But that's not the only step that you have to worry about. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is, well, how do you determine the actual elevation that you're going to use? And so for some shots, you're going to use the base elevation every time. And then some other shots, you might want to change it. Because depending on how you're trying to play the hole, most holes you want to hit where the bullseye's aimed. And so there's other factors that you have to consider in order to be able to make that shot. And so the most common one that you're going to see is tailwind and headwind. And I normally say heavy, because if you just have a slight cross tail or a slight cross tail or a slight cross head, typically you don't have to make any significant elevation changes, but you can play around with that to see if you want to add 5% or not in small or light cross head and tails. If you get a heavier tail or a straight head or tail, my normal rule of thumb is add 10% to your base elevation. If you're trying to get the ball to land where you're aiming. In tailwind situations, though, sometimes there's those send it shots we all love, or we're trying to get the ball to go farther down the fairway on a drive. And so in that case, you might want to just use your base elevation because you want the wind to push the ball farther as long as you have a clear landing spot. And so you'll adjust your base elevation and push up. And so there's not an exact science that you can use for every shot, because you might play some shots on some holes differently. But in theory and practice, adding 10% if you're trying to get your ball to land in where you aimed is a general rule of thumb when you're in heavier tail and head winds. Another thing that you can also consider is slope into the direction that you're pulling. So if you're pulling your rings up a hill or down a hill, you can also try to adjust your elevation to account for that. I will tell you that's not the preferred method to do that. There's going to be another video on pushing and pulling later on, and it's sort of explaining that concept. But you can try to adjust elevation to account for those differences. If you're pulling up or down a hill, we typically will do that in straight tail or straight head wind angles to account for the changed number of rings for that pull. But we don't recommend it in crosswind angles if you're pulling up or down a hill. We would tell you to really adjust push or pull to some of those things. But that'll be for another video. And then at the end of the day, sometimes the game's just unpredictable. There's elevations that just don't make sense. They're rare, but sometimes you might have to use 30% because of some bad spot that you're landing. And so you just know that you need more or less based on how you played it last time in the same wind. Like I said, those are rare to me, but they do come along of where you hit a shot and it just makes no sense where the ball went. But there's a ton of factors that we're going to go over through this series of what all actually affects where the ball goes. And one of the first things is making sure you get the elevation right. But there's several other factors that can impact where your ball ultimately lands that we're going to cover later on in this series. So I was going to go over a couple of different shots that we used in the big catch tournament here. And so this is hole 2 in the last tournament, and we took 2 different approaches based off of the wind direction on the same hole. So here you see we had a slight cross tailwind angle. And so we were playing this at 10% elevation because that was its based elevation there. But you can see our landing spot was a few rings, or we were using overpower to be able to get to where we wanted the ball to land. And so here we were using a 10% elevation to actually adjust for the elevation change, and then we pushed up 1.5 rings so we didn't have to use overpower. On the same exact hole with the same exact shot on a later hole in the tournament, we were doing the same exact setup, but here we had a straight tail, and we went to max +5, and that's counterintuitive. What I told you in straight tails, you want to add elevation to your adjustment. But the reason we didn't do that here is because, remember, we want the ball to go further than when it's at rest. And so in this example, we actually eliminated the 1.5 ring push-up because we allowed the wind to push us further up to that landing position, and we actually adjusted less. You can do the exact opposite thing if you wanted to, of where you could use overpower and adjust more, but this was just an easier, simpler setup. But this shows you where elevation can change based off of where you want the ball to land. And so if we go back and look at our cross angle, we had to push up rings or either use overpower to get to our landing spot with a higher elevation. Here we lowered the elevation because we wanted the wind to push the ball up farther to land in our landing spot so we didn't have to do the push-up. On a different par 3 in that same exact tournament here, you're going to see that we was at a 40% elevation, but because I was pulling up a hill, we needed to do a 4-ring push toward the tee. When we originally started doing this hole, we tried to use a 90% elevation, but the problem is that this wasn't exactly a straight tailwind. And so by pulling more elevation, it actually got us offline with our landing spot. So 40% here was the ultimate elevation that we had to go with, that took into account the base elevation plus the wind push that we're going to get, and we had to do a 4-ring push-up because of pulling uphill. And then similarly, we had a separate wind, and so we had to account for that heavier tailwind angle, and we ended up having to do a similar pushback towards the tee for rings to count pulling up the hill, and 40% elevation. 10% of that was due to the fact that we had that tailwind angle. So there you have it. That's our first video on how to determine elevation on your own while you're playing Golf Clash. I really hope you enjoyed the video. Please join our Discord server. Link will be in the description. Join any of our YouTube channels. Links will be in the description. Hopefully you're enjoying our guides while you're playing tournaments, and hopefully this will help you. Remember, the key to this is practice. Practice, practice, practice. If you have questions or don't understand, feel free to reach out to us. We can do a friendly, you can jump in Discord and we can demonstrate this approach for you. But hopefully this will help improve your game while you're playing tour play, or if you're trying to build your own shots for tournaments or anything else, and give you some good indicators of how you can figure out elevation on your own. So with that said, have a great night and have fun and good luck.